Is this okay? Okay. Well, thanks for coming on at 10 a.m. In the morning. I appreciate you all making the effort. As I was preparing for this talk, I can't say it was enjoyable. I had to revisit this period of the Labour anti-Semitism controversy, which raged for 4 years, and it wasn't a fun time to be in and around the Labour Party, also in and around the kind of Jewish left at the time. It's hard to kind of remember now, maybe, but it was in its protractedness and in its profile and in its virulence. The campaign to accuse Labour of anti-Semitism under Corbyn, it was really unprecedented in modern British history. I mean, one study counted 5,500 national newspaper examples in that period, solely devoted to anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And the tone was just, like, the register in which these allegations were made was hysterical. I just brought a couple of quotes because even I forgot exactly the kinds of things that were being said. So in the national press, Labour was stigmatised as, quote, the party of bigots and thugs where Jew haters are cheered, a racist party, the most anti-Semitic party in generations, a cesspit of anti-Semitism infested with Jew hatred, Corbyn's anti-Semite army. This was all in the national press. Corbyn himself was said to be, excuse my language, a fucking anti-Semite and racist. That was by one of his own party MPs. The most dangerous man in Britain, Britain's most prominent anti-Semite, the most dangerous racist in British politics. One columnist alleged that he wants to reopen Auschwitz, and all three of Britain's Jewish communal newspapers, they published on the same day a joint front-page editorial asserting that a Corbyn-led government would pose an existential threat to Jewish life in Britain. And claims like that, they weren't marginal excesses on the fringes of an otherwise kind of sober narrative, they were the narrative. Basically, the claims boiled down to three, or two really. Corbyn himself was an anti-Semite, that was one basic claim. The second claim was anti-Semitism within the Labour Party had become pervasive, widespread, and had surged under and because of the leadership of Corbyn. Those were the two basic claims. I reviewed the evidence in detail at the time, as did others. No persuasive evidence was ever presented in support of them. Corbyn himself, I mean, I don't know if people are aware of his record, but he could probably lay claim to being the most consistent and active opponent of racism among Britain's political class. He was an anti-fascist campaigner for decades. He constantly cited the famous Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when the far right was beaten back by Jewish activists and left anti-fascists, as an example for him, as a model. And funnily enough, like throughout those years, he was surrounded by his closest advisors were left-wing Jews. You know, I mean, I can go further into those, but that was just a libel against the man. And then as for the broader picture, far from being in imminent and overwhelming danger, the picture is that British Jews are, on aggregate, the most prosperous, well-integrated minority group in Britain. According to the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which is one of the most kind of respected of these research bodies. Levels of anti-Semitism in Britain are among the lowest in the world, and Jews were, quote, seen overwhelmingly positively by an absolute majority of the population. The prevalence of anti-Jewish stereotypes among Labour supporters didn't rise under Corbyn, but fell. That's according to, or remained fairly consistent. That's according to this organisation called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is virulently anti-Corbyn. Levels of anti-Semitism were not unusually high among people on the left and among Labour supporters. In fact, according to the Jewish policy research, Britain's political left was on average, quote, a more Jewish-friendly segment of the population. And similarly, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is a very right-wing anti-left group, it said Labour Party supporters were, quote, less likely to be anti-Semitic than other voters. Indeed, even as it should be noted that a lot of the individual claims of anti-Semitism made during those years against Labour members, they almost all refer to online posts, tweets and Facebook posts and so on. Groups of people spent hours and hours, days and days, weeks and weeks, trawling the internet, trying to find, sometimes going back years, 8 years into the past, trying to find evidence of a dodgy tweet here, dodgy post there, which they then used. Firstly, they sent it to the press to create this impression of a mounting, pervasive anti-Semitism crisis in the party. They also flooded Labour's complaint system with thousands of vexatious, duplicate, trivial complaints, which stalled the whole process completely. Just to give one sense of that, in 1 year, 2019, half of all anti-Semitism complaints were submitted by one guy who just spent all day looking for, you know. So this wasn't like an organic grievance. This was a campaign to try to manufacture a grievance. Even so, the proportion of members that ended up being going through Labour's disciplinary procedures for anti-Semitism, it rounds down to 0. It was 0.24% in the end. And that's just who had a complaint against them, not a valid complaint. Of course, the way it was covered in the media was very different. One survey found that they asked the average member of the public, what proportion of Labour members do you think have had an anti-Semitism complaint directed against them? And the average answer was 34%. So they thought 1/3 of Labour's membership had had an anti-Semitism complaint. Again, the actual figure was less than 1/4 of 1%. The main way in which this impression of kind of pervasive anti-Semitism in the party was created was by taking individual unrepresentative posts by random party members or alleged party members and generalizing from them to an organization of 500,000 members. That was the main strategy. But there were also like high-profile cases where simple fabrications and fraud were used. So at the time, I investigated one such case. It was at the annual conference of Labour in 2017. They had a conference in Brighton. And I wrote an article saying, is this a Labour anti-Semitism conference or Nuremberg rally? Because the way that it was portrayed in the media, they said it was like quotes like the anti-Semitism in the rancid guts of Labour has become centre stage, and the whiff of bloodlust rises from Brighton. I remember that was one quote. Well, I looked into every single concrete allegation that was made in relation to that conference, every one. 0 held up to scrutiny, none, and almost all of them implicated Jews. Like almost all of the alleged perpetrators were Jewish members of the party or Jewish people who were speaking there. So there was just straight out fabrication in many cases. Now, the next question is, so in other words, in my view, there was no Labour anti-Semitism crisis. There's some anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, but the idea that there was a crisis of anti-Semitism was a fraud. Now, the next question is, well, who generated this idea? Who generated the campaign? Briefly, in my opinion, there were three kind of distinct but overlapping networks. You had pro-Israel groups, pro-Israel Jewish organizations and media publications. You had the Labour right, which at the parliamentary level hated Corbyn, hated the Corbyn leadership. It was kind of a fluke which led to Corbyn being able to kind of parachute over them into the leader's office. And from day one, he was isolated, and he had a lot of support among the membership, which grew massively to become like the largest mass member party in Europe, I believe. But among the parliamentary level, he was completely isolated and despised. So you had pro-Israel groups, you had the Labour right, and then you had the full breadth of Britain's establishment, political and media class that united to defeat this popular insurgency. And I think every element of that coalition was crucial. If it wasn't for the Jewish organizations and the pro-Israel groups, charges of anti-Semitism by the Tories or the Labour right, they wouldn't have had credibility if they hadn't been validated by the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Chronicle, and so forth. So they provided the credibility and the validity to the allegations. On the other hand, if it had only been the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Chronicle and so on making these allegations, no one else would have heard of them. I mean, they've been accusing the left and the Palestine Solidarity Movement of anti-Semitism for years, and usually it rarely makes a stir. It became a national issue in these years because, for their own reasons, the major media outlets, the Labour right and the Tories amplified those allegations to defeat Corbyn and to demobilise his newly mobilised mass base. So that's basically the coalition that I see as having driven this crisis. Actually, recently, just last week on Sunday in The Observer, there was just one snapshot into this coalition. It was revealed. There was an article which recounted that. So there's an organisation called Labour Together. It's run by this guy called Morgan McSweeney, and he is from the Labour right, and he got money from a big pro-Israel donor and also a big kind of Blairite donor to incubate a replacement to Corbyn quite early on. And they ended up being Starmer's leadership campaign, forming the backbone of Starmer's leadership campaign. And what this article revealed is they sent people to systematically troll Facebook posts to dig up anti-Semitic or purportedly anti-Semitic messages from random Labour Party members and farm them out to journalists to destabilise the leadership. And secondly, this guy Morgan McSweeney, he was very upset that Labour Party members were reading this alternative media outlet called The Canary, which was pro-Corbyn, and he was very upset that among Labour Party supporters and members, as many people were reading The Canary as were reading The Guardian. And this upset him greatly, and he even said something like, either we defeat The Canary or The Canary defeats us. And so what they did, it seems, is set up this group called Stop Funding Fake News, without disclosing their connection to it, of course. And this group accused the Canary, which was edited by a Jewish woman, of anti-Semitism, and pressured advertisers to stop allowing their adverts to be placed on that website, and they basically crippled the site. So that's just the one little snapshot into how these different coalitions, you've got a pro-Israel donor funding a Labour right campaigner who used anti-Semitism to destabilise the leadership and neutralise one particular media outlet that was supporting it. Of course, most of what happened is we don't have, it's behind the scenes, but it's one intriguing glimpse. The next question is, well, there was this anti-Semitism crisis, or this kind of, in my opinion, confected controversy. What was the effect? Like, what role did it play in Corbyn's defeat and the Corbyn movement's defeat in 2019? If you listen to leading figures in the British Jewish community, it had a big effect. Like, they publicly claimed credit for defeating Corbyn. So, for example, Marie van der Zijl, who is, she was the head of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, she boasted about how, in 2018, about how we were able to keep this issue dominating the headlines for weeks on end. The head of the campaign against anti-Semitism crowed, "We did it," after the election result, and so on. So they've claimed a great deal of credit. However, I don't think the evidence really supports it. I haven't looked at, I should caveat, I haven't looked at recent studies, if there have been any. I looked at it a couple of years ago, so what I'm reporting to you is what I found then. It was Brexit. The overwhelming reason was Brexit. That's why Labour lost in 2019. The anti-Semitism issue really didn't cut through to the broader population. A Populous survey, Populous is an organisation that monitors the media and the impact of media stories on public opinion. At the peak of the hysteria over Labour anti-Semitism, which was in 2018, Populous found, quote, "This is simply not a big story for most people." And then the following year, in 2019, Populous reviewed the most noticed news stories of that year, and they found that while Brexit utterly dominated public attention throughout the year, anti-Semitism just didn't even mention merit a mention in that report. However, so as a direct impact, it was a secondary and tertiary factor in Labour's defeat. That's my reading of the evidence. But I think its indirect impacts were greater and harder to quantify. What were the indirect impacts? Number one, they made Corbyn appear weak. The way that he responded or failed to respond effectively to this issue. It made him appear like a weak leader. And one of the top reasons people cited for why they didn't like Corbyn and didn't see him as prime ministerial material was weakness. Now, Brexit again contributed to that because he was trying to manage this divided coalition on that issue, and so he started vacillating. And his whole appeal had been his moral conviction and so on. So once he started vacillating over some issues, it really undermined his appeal. But nonetheless, his apologetic and sometimes inconsistent stances on the anti-Semitism question and his inability to just take control of the issue contributed to his perception as a weak leader. The second indirect impact, I think, was the demoralising effect it had and the disorientating effect that it had on the base, on the mass membership. I mean, that was an active, enthused, confident membership was his only real base of support. I mean, as I say, he was completely isolated at the parliamentary level of the party, in the media. He had some union support, but the membership was his real source of strength. And I can tell you subjectively, you know, going through that at the time, it was just this mounting feeling of dread. Every summer, sometimes every spring, there'd be another anti-Semitism controversy for days on end. Prominent left commentators in the media wouldn't defend the membership against some of these sweeping, unevidenced denunciations of them as a bunch of racists. The leadership itself didn't give people a strong line, and sometimes made concessions that were confusing for people because they weren't true. And so it was just really disorientating and demoralizing. I mean, many of these people, it's their first time in politics, and they entered the Labour Party very excited to try and change the country, end poverty and so on, and suddenly they're being depicted as Corbyn's anti-Semite army, and no one really defended them. So that was another indirect indirect impact. It drained activist morale. Finally, I just want to kind of throw out some lessons as an invitation to then discussion. Because I do think the propaganda offensive against Corbyn on this issue has kind of fashioned a template that can be used and has been used against left forces elsewhere. You saw it even with Bernie Sanders when he was looking like before he lost, when he was looking like a real threat. You suddenly saw the proliferation of all these groups: combat anti-Semitism movement, stop anti-Semitism. Like there was like a list of a dozen groups suddenly started being forming, and they were ready to do the Corbyn playbook all over again. It never really happened because Bernie, his campaign ended before. It would have, obviously he has some protection for being Jewish, but it would have gone after the Squad and Bernie for associating with them and so forth. So this is a template, so it's important for every other left movement to think how to respond. Here's the lessons I took from it. Number one, don't try to appease the unappeasable. Don't mistake a pretext for a grievance. Many times, the leadership of the Labour Party was counselled and took the counsel to compromise and say, okay, we don't really agree with this, but let's just expel this person, suspend this person, even though they didn't do anything wrong. Let's adopt the IHRA definition, even though we don't agree with it. Because maybe that will get people off our backs, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because that was none of those things were ever really the goal. The goal was to get rid of Corbyn and to defeat Corbynism. And every time these concessions were made, it just encouraged the other side to press on, now from a stronger position. So, for example, like, there was one case, so Corbyn had appeared at an event where a Holocaust survivor called Meyer also appeared, and Meyer used his speech at that event to use his experience as a survivor of the Holocaust to talk about the suffering of the Palestinians. And the fact that Corbyn had appeared alongside him at this event was cited as more evidence of his anti-Semitism. And Corbyn apologised for appearing there. And the thing is, when you do that, I think he later expressed regret that he did apologise for that. But my point is that whenever someone apologises for something like that, it validates the accusation, and it means that everyone else finds it much more difficult to push back against. It establishes a precedent. Because then, if anyone else tries to dispute that new standard that's been set, the response is, well, even Corbyn apologised for it. Even he accepted that's problematic or anti-Semitic. So you just validate these false premises. So that would be my first lesson. None of those concessions that Labour made silenced its critics for 1 second, but they did demoralise its members and confuse them. The second point, which is closely related, which is don't collude in falsehood, stick closely to truth. Taking anti-Semitism seriously, which everyone should, it means being honest about it. It doesn't mean deferring to this or that interest group about it. It doesn't mean just saying things or doing things to get some media pressure off your back. If you take something seriously, it means you invest resources to find out what's the reality of the situation, and then you speak that truth, regardless of what the media reaction will be. I remember that, as someone who was writing at the time, there was like a premise that you had to accept in order to be allowed into the mainstream conversation about these issues. And if you didn't accept this premise, then you couldn't speak. You're just out in the wilderness. And that premise was, there is a Labour anti-Semitism crisis. And then, if you accept that, there's some debate allowed, like, so what should be done about it, who's to blame, etc., etc. But the evidence was very clear that there wasn't a Labour anti-Semitism crisis. Or, to put it the other way, no strong evidence had been presented to show that there was. But by going along with that, once you accept that basic premise, it becomes much harder to fight all these other demands that then follow. So stick to truth. Stick to truth. That's my second. That was my second lesson from it. A third would be Corbyn never. And these criticisms, I don't mean it as like, you know, Corbyn's a bad guy or something. I mean, he was under a very difficult position. But again, in the spirit of drawing lessons, he never called out what was going on for what it was. He never called out the agendas that were at play. He never pointed out how weird it was that we should be taking lectures on anti-racism for groups that support apartheid elsewhere. He never frankly called out the machinations that were going on behind the scenes. And the problem with that is that it left the membership, who's trying to figure out what's going on, but doesn't have access to the behind the scenes dynamics, confused. And not in a position to gain a real understanding of what's happening. And in my opinion, this is a very common problem with insiders, even principled insiders who want a mass politics. They don't see it as their role to constantly inform the wider movement what's going on. And I think that was a huge mistake. Corbyn should have, for example, with the controversy around the IRA definition, adopting the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. By the way, I don't think it's right to say Corbyn capitulated over that. He tried to not include the problematic bits of that example, but he just didn't have the backing of the National Executive Committee. So he did what he could, but he didn't have the votes within the body that decides these things. But he never explained all of that publicly. That's the thing. Like, all of this was behind closed doors. And so I think that's a huge mistake, and I think any leader in Parliament who wants to try to have a mass politics should always inform their members about what's going on. Another point, don't genuflect before communal representatives. Don't just defer to anyone who claims that they represent this or that community, even if they actually do. It happened to be the case that in Britain, when the Board of Deputies claims to be the voice of British Jewry, it's actually a very dubious claim. They're not as representative as one might think. But even if they were genuinely a democratically representative body for the whole of British jury. It doesn't mean that they're right about these issues. That's the thing. It's like British Hindu groups. They said that Labour's position on Kashmir was a reflection of Hindu phobia. And maybe they believe that, and maybe British Hindus believe that at large, but it's not true. And this principle of the principle of always listening to representatives of minority groups and making extra efforts to hear them and listen to them is a good one, because if you don't make extra efforts, then their voices will be excluded. But to say that one should defer automatically to them, rather than applying standards of reason and so on to what they claim, that's too far. And it also often means that minorities of the minorities, so left-wing Jews say, who are a minority within the Jewish community, they get completely trampled on if you just allow self-proclaimed, the establishment Jewish groups to be the sole voice for that community, which is exactly what happened in the Labour case. I can talk about that more if you want. I guess the final thing is to hold true to the best libertarian traditions of the left. Obviously, there are very illiberal traditions on the left as well, but I think the best of the left has always held free speech to be an important value, and left movements have indeed been at the forefront of fights for civil liberties, including freedom of expression throughout the 20th century, and I think that's been forgotten in recent years and recent decades, and certain other principles have become kind of a common sense, like any speech which is offensive or is considered hateful should be censored. That anyone who has uttered such speech should be expelled from an organisation. Principles like that. And exactly those ideas were then used by pro-Israel Jewish groups in this controversy to say, well, why can't we define the oppression that we face? If you're saying, well, every minority group should define its own oppression, and then anyone who infringes that should be silenced or driven out, well, why doesn't it apply to Jews then? I mean, why can't Jews define anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism? And then if someone is anti-Zionist, then why don't you silence them? And that's one of the reasons why this was so disorientating for people in the Corbyn movement, because they did take these ideas very seriously. Corbyn himself was a subscriber to the idea that you should always censor hate speech, and in general minorities should define their own oppression, and so on and so forth. So it was hard to know what to do when Jewish groups asked for the same principles to be applied to them. So I hope that experience prompts a kind of deep soul searching about whether it was a good idea to abandon or to erode the left's commitment to freedom of expression and to setting a very high threshold before being willing to silence people on the grounds of offence. There are other things to say, but maybe that's enough to kind of prompt a wider discussion, and thanks for listening.
I don't know how you think about this, but it's super interesting for our context. Actually, also many of the same sort of mechanisms are at play. Jonathan wants to ask a question. I just want to maybe also ask, but we'll take a few questions, but if we could talk about sort of practical examples. I was reading that in some areas of Britain there was suddenly a big group of people maybe linked to sort of or orchestrated by the Israeli lobby that suddenly became members of the Labour Party. There were different strategies, sort of concrete strategies to interfere or something like this. I don't know if you have a little bit more of sort of concrete actions that happened also. I would like to hear about this. Jonathan, and then Yolanda.
I'm looking forward to that. It's heard. Okay, thanks a lot, Jamie, and thanks for coming. Yesterday there was an event where also Puya, Paksat, and Wieland here, Copenhagen, were. And I had a question actually to Puya there, but I will ask it here because you could say it from the sort of UK angle. And so Corbyn and the IHRA definition and the attempt to tailor it in a favorable way. This failed. There are different interpretations of why and what the nature of the failure was. But this is a current issue for us in Denmark, where there's discussion of what is the definition that was put in 2022 already, that mentions IRA but doesn't mention the examiners, and how much of the IRA in its entirety does actually apply, and what should be the strategy in relation to it. What are our options? Is it a question of fighting a battle to abandon IHRA? What do you think about the options?
I take another question and a few more.
I wasn't at the meeting yesterday.
I
I was not, my name is Yolanda, I was not at the meeting yesterday. Damn, I didn't know it was there. I would really have loved to go. And yeah, thank you for coming. When you say we left have to stick to the truth, and then before say that there are stock funding fake news, then I'm like, oh my God, the truth will never lose, it will always win. But this is like stock-funded fake news. I'm like, oh my God, is it real? Is it how I interpret it? That it's actually on the stock market?
Oh, sorry. It was Stop Funding Fake News. That was just the name of the campaign.
Stop funding.
Yeah.
Oh my God! No, kidding me? We will never lose, but still. Oh my God! Tak. Okay, jeg skal prøve at høre bedre efter.
Yeah, sure.
I'll take a few more, honestly. Helle?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of the ways that you were portraying that the campaign was organized. We see tendencies to that here as well, especially one journalist of a very small tabloid who sort of uses the same way, and then the bigger papers take up his stories about random people in, for example, an NGO board, which is not a board, it's sort of representative of 100 people. 2 people were accused of posting anti-Semitic posts on Facebook, and now they had to withdraw, and the organization is Action Aid, and it's been necessary for them to sort of go into this discussion. Also, they're trying to undermine. We don't have the Labour Party, but the Red Green Alliance, by of course digging people's past. PFLP is a big issue for one of the big national newspapers and so on. So there's definitely some groups that are digging into these things now that you were saying. And I'm just thinking, because what I feel now is that they're really on the road to say that we're all terrorists, or we're all supporting terrorists. And I'm just wondering if you have any ideas, or was there any examples of doing something, how you work against this? Because the papers are definitely not going to change their way, and it's like they're sort of making conclusions from one thing to another thing that doesn't add up. I mean, and that's also how we all become anti-Semitic all of a sudden. So, are there any examples of people that sort of went against this undermining of people on a very
Thanks, Helle. Yeah. If you can make it a little bit shorter, it would be easier. But yes, I think you and Morten Morten? Yeah. Yes?
Okay. Yeah, I find you very, very interesting. And as I said, we have similar trouble in Denmark. We're also facing a campaign. Not as strong, but it is there. Mm-hmm. And we know that it's coming. And our organization is also a little wobbly about how to do and what to do and what not to do. I'm very interested in knowing how do we counterattack this. What do we do? I'm not interested in don't do this, don't do this. I understand very well, don't make this mistake, don't make this mistake, fine. Now I'm also asking, what do we do? What do we proactively do to counter this? Not, don't tell me, not don't do this. But
we can just shift it, shift it around, right? Call them out, he said, exactly. For instance. Yeah. And that's one point, sort of do talk about, there's a lobby, it works like this. I was looking into electronic intifada, and they revealed this Reut Institute that had sort of made some quite, they got secret documents of strategies of how to split the Labour Party, sort of a clear strategic paper on how to make a divide between people. So it was a whole big strategy that was followed. I don't know if you heard about it, but it was sort of so to reveal some of these things and make it public and talk about it. That's at least one strategy, I would say. Now, Morten, you're the last one. Then I let Jamie talk.
Okay. Thank you for what we have to say today and yesterday. It was amazing. A little short question, then another one, but
very short.
No, I will try. Otherwise, I come back later. Okay? But the first one was that what happened with when the current Prime Minister got in power back then through this campaign. Was it an orange that fell in October, or was he actually, or that group, very aimed at getting there, and were they, how can I say? Yeah, was it their game in principle?
What, like, did they want him to be the...
Not just one. Were they the ones instigating the whole thing as a leader in this, and was it actually just to get in power, or was it a different kind of play? But I want to say a little short thing also. A little bit in defense of Tony, no, now I forgot his name. Corbyn, thank you. That when you are in charge, you mention one thing that one should inform one's group of people, so on, bankers and so on, about what is going on. When you are in the midst of a crisis, and he had been elected, and he was kind of lifted in a golden chair, and then the crisis immense, and then you have to understand, and you are losing faith. All these things happen in parallel. And it's not because I agree with that one shouldn't say anything and do anything, but it is a human thing. It's quite difficult to do anything in a situation where things are falling apart and what you were working for.
Good.
Later I will ask some other questions.
Okay, this was a little bit of a mix, but we stay on the topic, I think.
Yeah. So on the IHRA, firstly, does everyone know what the IHRA definition is? So I don't need to... Okay, so yeah, there was this controversy where basically... So, Labour's Code of Conduct, traditionally before all of this furore broke out, it said that members will not be sanctioned merely for the expression of their beliefs. So that was a kind of libertarian principle in its Code of Conduct. And under the pressure of this controversy, they jumped that and they changed it to say that it will be considered a sanctionable offence to make bigoted speech. Okay, so what counts as bigoted speech? They had to include a definition of anti-Semitism in the Code of Conduct. And the demand from the main Jewish groups in Britain was to make this the IHRA definition. In the end, Labour drafted this Code of Conduct on Anti-Semitism, which largely followed the IHRA definition. It added some extra examples which were more appropriate specifically to left-wing, kind of anti-capitalist anti-Semitism that can sometimes appear in left spaces. So they tried to tailor it more towards their milieu. And they excluded some of the most obviously pro-Israel ideological examples. And this caused a huge furore. Like 68 rabbis wrote a joint letter saying, who is this Corbyn to think he can tell Jews what anti-Semitism is? This is what prompted, I think this is right, this is what prompted that joint front page editorial that I mentioned saying a Corbyn government would be an existential threat to Jewish life and so on. And the claim was made by all of these organizations that the IHRA definition, it's not a pick and choose, it's not a pick and mix thing. You either adopt the whole thing as it is, verbatim, not changing one letter of one word of the sacred text, including all of these ridiculous pro-Israel examples of anti-Semitism. Or if you do change one letter of one word of one example of the sacred text, it means you've rejected the whole IHRA definition, and therefore you're arrogantly telling Jews what anti-Semitism is. That was the big claim. And even the IHRA itself got in on that act. The permanent office published on the IHRA website this statement from 7 British ambassadors to that organisation, which said, if you change one word, it's no longer the IHRA definition. Now the thing about it is it's a complete lie, because the reality is the IHRA itself didn't include any examples in the definition that it adopted in 2016, because it couldn't get agreement on them, because some countries, the Scandinavian countries especially, were like, these are going to infringe on free speech. So that's why they put this box around that core around the main definition and had the examples after it. So it was a complete fabrication and fraud, but it was useful to paint Labour as anti-Semitic. And actually the UK's ambassador to that organisation, to the IHRA, Lord Eric Pickles, he is also a Tory. He used to be the chairman of the Conservative Party. He was also a long-time leading figure in Christians United for Israel. He knew full well, because he was at the meeting where this definition was adopted, that the examples weren't part of it, but he pretended that they were, and he used that to attack Labour all that summer as being, not caring about Jews and so forth. So another example of just straight out lies. Did that answer the question fully, or?
How do you see that reflecting upon our current situation in Denmark, having allegedly accepted the text box that God has?
All I would say is, obviously, look, there's many cases where countries didn't accept the examples and only the text box. Germany is an example of that. But then it's nevertheless publicly afterwards represented falsely as if they had accepted the examples, and then those authorities never correct the record because they don't want the headache, and so it just crystallizes into truth. So the lesson there is basically, I would be very wary of thinking, oh, we can just fudge this and accept a little bit and not all of it and so on, because the reality is it will subsequently be presented as if you've endorsed the whole thing. And if you don't want to do that, then just say that now and don't wait to have that fight when you're in a weaker position. On Action Aid, look, I think I obviously don't know all of the details of that. I have seen the cartoons and I saw a little bit about the response of some officials there. I think it seems to me like they're kind of panicking and not behaving in a very smart way in response to this controversy. I think they should just say there's no reason to think that these cartoons are anti-Semitic, and that's the end of the matter as far as we're concerned. And as a secondary, if they then want to go on the offensive and point out what the agendas behind claiming that they're anti-Semitic are, and if they have the information to do that in a credible way, then that might be useful. But always start with, like, never, like, I think the mistake would be to only say, like, if a factual allegation is made and you respond with, oh, there's a bad agenda behind it, without addressing the factual allegation, that's not persuasive. Because in the end, motive is, like the most important thing is it true, what's being alleged? So first address that, and if it's not, forthrightly say that, and then if it's not, if it is true, you don't need to go into the motives. If it isn't, it might then be helpful to explain to people what is the political agenda at play here. The third question, and you shouldn't throw your employees under the bus publicly for when they haven't done anything wrong. I mean, that seems obvious to me. Positively, what do we do? I mean, a lot of what I said, you could just switch it. So don't insist on the, like I say, insist on the truth always, and that is a firm fact. Like, believe in people and the possibility of rational persuasion. Where you are, firstly, where the allegations are correct, then you should deal with them. But where they are not, then feel confident that you can explain that they're not, and that can actually reach people. I do think also be proactive. Like, if there is a real problem of anti-Semitism, for example, in certain areas of the country, in the country as a whole, and so on, don't cede that ground of combating that issue only to groups which also have anti-left agendas or anti-Palestine agendas. You can proactively try and create coalitions with anti-racist organizations, including Jewish groups, and make the issue one of your own, and be proactive about it. I think that's a really good thing to do. I think, so one issue which I didn't touch upon, but one of the things that hamstrung Labour was ideally what they could have said when particular cases of anti-Semitism or allegations were brought to the attention of the leadership. They could have said what, say, the Starmer leadership would say now, which is, we have a process for dealing with complaints. I don't comment on these kind of things. I'm going to let the complaints procedure run its course, and that's it. You know, so you don't feed the controversy, you just always say. Now, the problem is Labour's complaints procedure was a complete mess, and so they couldn't really credibly say that. Have a good, sort out, if you're a party, I mean, depends, I don't know how the parties are structured here and so on, but have a process in place for what to do when allegations of racism of some kind or another are brought, and then make sure that system works. Because then you can say, truthfully, we have a system. So we don't need to comment on this in a media sort of way. That's another proactive step that one could take. And finally, political I mean, I don't really like the education, it feels a bit authoritarian. Discussion, where particular issues do arise, and I don't know, maybe some conspiracy theories are becoming prominent among some members of a party or something. Talk about it, arrange discussion meetings, hash it out. It doesn't need to, don't try and brush it under the rug, don't try and censor it. That's why I don't like education, don't just in a one-way monologue tell people, just talk about it. So those are a few proactive steps. I don't think there's anything Labour could have done to have avoided the media campaign against it. on anti-Semitism, on Corbyn being a Czech spy, on Labour members being bullies, on anything and everything. There's nothing they could have done to stop that, because again, it wasn't a grievance, it was a pretext. But there were steps that could have been done to mitigate its demoralising effect and disorientating effect on the membership. And there was one more question, which was in defence of Corbyn, how difficult it was, practically speaking. Totally agree. I mean, they were fighting fires from day one. Like, it was so hard to be proactive about anything because they were just constantly bombarded with hostility from within and without from day one. That's part of the difficulty of being, you know, maybe like the model normally of how a left leader takes power is you slowly build up power from the bottom up, and you have power in the wider society, and then the lower rungs of the party in the middle, and then eventually, and Corbyn kind of was catapulted through some fluky events into the leadership office, and he was completely surrounded by enemies within and without. And the complaint system I mentioned is a good example of that. For the first 2 years of this anti-Semitism controversy, that whole complaints apparatus, which has to deal with anti-Semitism complaints, was in the hands of his bitter factional enemies. And they didn't even let him know how many complaints there were, and how many were being dealt with, and so on. And when one of Corbyn's kind of allies finally took control of that unit, like two years in, they were pretty shocked about the fact that not just anti-Semitism complaints, but pretty much all complaints were just not dealt with. They were just left on the servers. So he faced, it was very tough. It was very tough.
Are you saying this was sort of deliberate sabotage-like, or what? Because this was like hinting a little bit back to my more sort of concrete sort of split attempts and sort of infiltration. I know it sounds conspiracy-like, but that's maybe also part of the picture a little bit.
It's hard to say that, because it's hard to say. It could be, but there's definitely no kind of smoking gun proof that the reason why the people in charge of complaints at that time didn't process anti-Semitism complaints was because they knew it would make the leadership look bad in the media. You can make kind of speculations, because it does seem weird, for example, if they know that the party's getting raked over the coals in the press every day, why don't they start to, take some action on some of these complaints?
Yeah, it wasn't Ian McNichol himself who knew about that whole backlog of complaints. Wasn't he also attacking them for not dealing with complaints in public?
Yeah, so later, once he left. So, yes, there's all kinds of behaviour which would seem... There are other potential explanations, like passing the buck for terrible behaviour, that are possible. I think it's very plausible to think there was an element of sabotage, but I can't say that we know that there was. Another example for why it seems very odd is Labour. There was one story where someone had gone through this Facebook group called Palestine Live, and they found a whole bunch of people, some of whom were posting anti-Semitic stuff, some of whom seemed to be Labour members and were Labour members, and it became a big media story. And an official in Corbyn's office looked through the dossier, a Jewish official it happens to be, James Schneider. He looked through the dossier and he was pretty appalled by some of the messages that he saw. And he wrote to the complaints unit and said, what are we doing? Like, can we progress this? Like, there's some really bad stuff in here. Can we take action against some of these people? And the person he was writing to, in the end, and he singled out, for example, as one particularly uncontroversial, egregious example. There was one guy who was posting Holocaust denial, in his Facebook group, and who seemed to be and he was a Labour member. So he's like, can't we just, like, for example, this is very clear cut, doesn't seem to be much of an investigation needed. Can't we just, like, suspend this guy and investigate? Because firstly, it's the right thing to do, and secondly, I need to reassure people, like, we are taking action on this. And then the complaints official didn't take any action on that, but instead suspended a Jewish peace activist who had not posted anything in the group or anything problematic, and there was no case against him. So that kind of behaviour, you know, it's really hard to explain as a good faith mistake. But I think that's the most. And then the final thing I'll say is those people later went on to this BBC Panorama show and posed as whistleblowers and said that all their best efforts to combat anti-Semitism and deal with these complaints have been thwarted by the Labour Party leadership, preventing them from taking action. And that's just completely untrue. Again, I think raises rational questions about their motives, but we don't have proof about deliberate sabotage.
Lars first and then you.
Okay. Let me say first that I enjoyed your speech, as I do everything, and every time I hear something, speak clearly and hold the values of truth and stuff like this. And then when I go out to watch the sort of the comments read on the Facebook post, I all know that's how it is really, because it is difficult to sort of be optimist when confronted with the sort of normalization of lies and genocide and whatever. It's very sort of. But the point, I'll get to the point quickly. You alluded to the fact that there are many different reasons for people to jump on the sort of anti-Semitism bandwagon, and also some of those reasons were sort of had nothing especially to do with Israel-Palestine, but rather to do with sort of NATO or whatever in Britain. I think it's the same is true here. Suddenly, much more people get sort of invested in the idea that anti-Semitism is everywhere and we need to do something about it. But is there any sort of strategic policy conclusions to draw from the fact that the manifold reasons for people to sort of invest in this idea? I mean, some of it doesn't have to do with anti-Semitism at all, but yeah, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Noah. This means a lot to me, this whole topic, because I was living in the UK at the time.
I see the 1,000-yard stare in your eye.
Yeah. In any case, what I wanted to ask was actually a Labour-specific question, but I guess it can be applied in other contexts as well. I'm wondering whether this like appeasement that you've been talking about can be like stretched out to a broader like to a critique of like the broader political tactics that were used during Corbyn's leadership. I'm thinking specifically about things like deselecting candidates and going towards more offensive strategies within the party to assert control, because the way that the Labour Party is structured, there's actually not a lot of accountability for people who are elected once and then maintain their position over a long span of time. That kind of I mean, what Corbyn did essentially was bring in so many new members into the party. He inflated the membership like crazy. Those people were foot soldiers. They could have gone to every single district where people are actively going against Corbyn, and Corbyn could have become a strong leader in that sense. That would have demonstrated a divided party, which I think people are always really concerned not to show a divided front. But I think that the divided front is going to be there no matter what. And what you have to do as a left force is assert power. So that's my take. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Okay.
Den sidste her, og så får han lov.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've been hectic since I came because I've been in need of a restroom badly, and I don't want to miss a word of what you're saying. But for me, it's obvious that there's a link between the foreign affairs apartment in Israel having this PR campaign in 10 different countries of Europe, inclusive Denmark, and this new law. For me, it's the same. It's like implementing this PR campaign into practice, blah, blah, and it's backed up by the whole government and our organization as well. How do we stop it? What do we do? Can I use the restroom?
Yes.
So you answer her questions when she's back.
Yeah.
The last, I think, I was the last question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the fact that
Last question. Okay. You can answer his question.
okay, whether Labour should have been more assertive under Corbyn in asserting its power through the party. For example, taking control of the complaints apparatus, at least in the sense of having someone who could give insight into what was going on. I remember asking a leading official in the Corbyn leadership at the time, like quite early on, I guess it would have been like, 2016 or 2017. Can you just tell me how many complaints of anti-Semitism have there been, and what's the results of them, and so on? Because that would help to understand how much truth is there in all of these claims. And they didn't know. They just didn't know, because it was a different department that was under control of their opponents. So it clearly would have been beneficial if they had had more control over different elements of the party. The question is, how viable would it have been to try to assert that in the way that Starmer has? Like, Starmer was pretty ruthless early on in getting rid of opponents at different levels of the party and putting in place cronies in those key places. Obviously, what would have, it would have been depicted as Stalinist, Corbyn exerting Stalinist, like purging control over the party in the press. And I don't think that's the reason not to do it, because he was being depicted as Stalin anyway, so that's not a reason not to do it. The only practical thing which I don't feel I'm able to comment on is, did they have the necessary, was it viable? Given how weak they were within the upper echelons of that party, could they have done that? Bear in mind how weak and isolated they were. They invited, even after Starmer participated in the coup, the attempt to unseat him, they invited him to be part of the cabinet because they couldn't find enough people to be in the shadow cabinet.
Here's the Brexit secretary.
Yeah. So I do think they lacked a ruthless. In general, I'm not a fan of ruthlessness in people, but you do need an element of that when you want to lead a party that's under that kind of constant assault from within and without. And I do think they lacked an element of ruthlessness, but I also do think they were in a very weak position. And I would be interested to know from someone who was strategizing from within. They obviously would have thought about, should we just go out and do many of these elections, and so if it was viable, could they have done that or not? If it was, then yeah, I agree with you. The two other questions are still otherwise occupied. Does anyone else have a question maybe I could answer in the meantime?
I would like you to forget a little bit about what happened in Britain and take it into present time, but on the same point, if it's okay. So I have to read what I own notes. You talked about this template, and I think you are very correct about this template. What happened then is what we used in the United States, in England, in Denmark, and part of why we had the discussion yesterday about the new definition of anti-Semitism. And I have listed up power struggle, cancel culture, livelihood in Denmark and other places. People lose their job. And we will be incriminated as either terror sympathizers, at least in Denmark, or they use the term currently in Ukraine called information terrorists, but we are going that way, I think, but I like your comments on it. And then a little bit about the present and the situation. You mentioned how it was a requirement to enter the debate in England, to have the Labour's anti-Semitic crisis, I think they call it something like that. In the current, I think we are required to condemn Hamas or whatever happened on 7th of October. And it's a taboo, a total taboo, particularly in Denmark. I don't really know how it is other places. In Germany, probably even worse. But you have American ex-military military people, who call it a military attack. What happened, I will not label it for anything, but you also said that we need to challenge this discourse. Yes, I'm finishing this much time. In Denmark, nobody have challenged it, and not even the Red-Green Party. As Toya mentioned yesterday, they are scared of being called either anti-Semitic or what's worse, terror sympathizers. But we have no discourse that allow us to even talk about what happened that day, unless you totally fall into the definition by the politicians and the media. So, but I like your reflection on it, at least, and bring it into what is happening today.
Okay, Helge, you also had a question.
Just a short question. I think it's very useful, your insight, to understand that this is part of a power struggle, and anti-Semitism is a very powerful tool if you can use it in that context, in a party or in general. What has the development been in Labour since? Have this issue continued to be at play, or has the problem evaporated? What has the current leadership done in that regard? To extend a couple of words.
Okay. Yes. So on the fact that there's a coalition of interests that, for their different reasons, found the anti-Semitism kind of attack line useful. I think that, in a way, a lesson can be learned from that, which is when we want to push back against certain campaigns like this, we should also try and form broader coalitions. So, for example, take the IHRA definition, for example. In the United States, it's not just pro-Palestine groups that are opposed to this and increasingly opposed to this, because on their own, pro-Palestine groups are still quite small, and if it's just them trying to wage this battle, they're probably not going to win. But it's also civil libertarian groups. It's like the ACLU. it's academic freedom groups, even some right-wing libertarians who are very pro-Israel don't like the idea of this definition being imposed in universities. And so I think often when trying to reach a broad audience that for whom Palestine really isn't one of their main issues, framing things in terms of defense of free speech, defense of academic freedom, or it depends on the issue, but finding broader causes which can unite many constituencies is an effective way to go. But then it means having to be principled about those issues. So for example, if you do want to unite a broader coalition in defense of free speech, then you actually have to support free speech, also stuff that we don't like. So those are decisions that have to be made. Now on the Israel's role in this, obviously by its nature this thing is, any such involvement would be hard for outsiders to talk about in any precision, because these things are quite covert. My feeling is, if Israel didn't try to unseat Corbyn, then there are some officials who should lose their jobs, because they've got whole departments whose job it is to coordinate campaigns against BDS, to promote Israel's image abroad, to undermine the image of people who are opposing Israeli policy abroad. And Corbyn was obviously known to be an opponent of Israeli policy. And in addition, London had long been identified by the Raid Institute and other groups which have some influence in Israel as a hub, they called it, of delegitimization. So I do think they thought a Corbyn government would be a significant problem for them. And so if the Ministry of Strategic Affairs of Israel was not trying to help groups here in Britain who opposed Corbyn do that more effectively, then that would be negligent on their part. So I assume they were. Now, what I would also say though is I don't think that was really necessary. I also don't think the Board of Deputies or Labour Friends of Israel needed Israel to tell them that Corbyn is someone who you should try to frustrate in his aims. That was known. So, my gut feeling is, I doubt we'll ever know the exact modes of assistance and collaboration and so forth, but I don't really think it's, we should view it as Israel concocted the whole thing, and if it wasn't for Israel, then none of it would happen. They were always going to oppose Corbyn. So that's my general sense of that. On Hamas and October 7th, your question there was about how to deal with the fact that it seems to be a requirement for entering the conversation to condemn it. And
we have to condemn, and the other thing was the taboo of what happened that day.
Taboo of what happened that day. Look, firstly I should say what my understanding of what happened that day is. My understanding is war crimes were committed by Hamas members and by members of other groups that took part, and by unaffiliated civilians. I think the UN report into what happened that day is pretty convincing. Very many people, civilians, were deliberately killed. And I don't think there's any reason to shy away from saying that. It's the truth. It's the truth as best as we understand it at the moment. As for condemning it, my feeling is, I don't have any problem condemning the act. When it comes to condemning the perpetrators of the acts, what they did, the reason why I would hesitate about doing that is just because I think it's important to understand the context which led them to behave in that way. here I personally found the analogy that Norman Finkelstein drew between what happened on October 7th and a slave revolt pretty grounding, morally speaking. Many slave revolts were extremely brutal and indiscriminate, killed civilians, mutilated babies, all the rest of it. The response of the white abolitionists at the time was basically to say, number one, we told you so. Like, if you keep treating people this way, this is what's going to happen. Number two, to put it in context. And number three, to say atrocities were committed, not to deny it. But to say this is how people often behave when you enslave them or trap them in a Gaza concentration camp for decades on end, and so on and so forth. That's how I would address that. In terms of that's my opinion. Now, as a political strategy for a party, that's why there are never rules for these kinds of things. Like, you have to judge the context, which is always very specific. And I don't know enough about the Danish context to know what would be a wise line to take. But my feeling is, for a political party, I don't think that they should. I wouldn't have a big problem with them condemning these atrocities on October 7th. I just think that it's very important for them to put it in context. To say, just like Antonio Gutierrez said, it didn't happen in a vacuum. The Secretary General of the United Nations. It didn't happen in a vacuum. And then to explain the siege of Gaza, the occupation of Gaza, the repeated massacres in Gaza, and so on and so forth, which have brought us to this point. That seems to me a perfectly defensible position to take on that. On Labour now, look, Starmer won the leadership contest by presenting himself as a Corbyn continuity candidate, which was a complete calculated fraud. And as soon as he gained power, he purged anyone on the left from any position of influence within the party. The authoritarian instincts, which he displayed as Director of Public Prosecutions, which was legitimized by the anti-Semitism campaign. You know, we must show zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, so we must proactively surveil all members' social media feeds. We can suspend and interrogate and expel people if they ever posted one thing that was off colour or anything like that. That kind of behaviour, which was legitimized by the anti-Semitism hysteria, wasn't, of course, confined to that. So, you know, Starmer said that he forbade any MP from signing any statement by Stop the War criticising NATO in the context of Ukraine, for example. And he forbade Labour MPs from joining trade union pickets. I mean, he's been extremely authoritarian in his party management style. And in my opinion, that was all legitimised by the Labour anti-Semitism issue, even though it's now spread well beyond it. Labour anti-Semitism has kind of vanished. It's completely vanished as an issue. Apparently all the anti-Semites like disappeared in a puff of smoke. No one's looking through Facebook pages anymore, and all the rest of it. Which of course, in my opinion, reveals how opportunistic the whole thing was. But yeah, he's now firmly in control of the party. There's pretty minimal chance that he would allow a Corbyn to happen again. And that's where we are now with that.
I'll just say a few things. I think what we need to do is also to have more awareness about what I call the mechanisms, the template, what is actually going on. one thing is sort of isolating and making splits, dividing, isolating the radicals, sort of making the discourse narrow. You're only allowed, as you said, Morten, you're only allowed to talk about these things in this way. When we talk about the condemnation, you all know that in Denmark it would end up that if you don't condemn and continue to condemn, because our Red-Green Alliance was caught in this, that they had to continue condemning, and they never reached the context, or they never reached the sort of the explanation.
This is like the apologies.
Yes, yes. And if they then sort of set the context, then they would be accused immediately of condoning. If you put the context, you condone. And they couldn't get out of this trap because they felt a little bit, is that right? Or sort of, so constantly it got worse and worse and worse, and we never had the clear speech around this, which would have been, this is strongly colonized, this is Gaza siege for many years and all this, so it was...
There was a brigadier general, a former brigadier general in the IDF called Shlomo Brom, and he published a piece in The Economist in either the day or the day after, immediate aftermath of October 7th. And he said, this is what happens when you try and rule over an oppressed people by force without giving them any window of an end date. That's the kind of thing that happens. And if he can say that, why can't other people? I just don't. It's just obviously true that many people who've been oppressed also commit atrocities in their struggle to end that oppression, and it's just not very, to my mind, it's not very complicated. Like, history's full of those examples, and it should. I don't feel the need to go into this silly, or to be scared by this silly attempt to refuse to analyze anything, just condemn only. The one thing I would say is, and maybe I'd be interested in people's thoughts on this. I feel that so there are some mistakes, I think, that the solidarity movement sometimes makes in the way it frames issues, which just make it easier for the other side than solidarity movement will always be attacked as anti-Semitic and so on, regardless of what it says. So there's no way to avoid those attacks. But there are ways, I think, to make them harder for them to land and reach a broad audience. And in my opinion, if the solidarity movement uses the language primarily and the idiom of human rights law and anchors itself firmly in pretty unimpeachable organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the United Nations, and so forth. Firstly, a broad public finds those institutions credible, usually rightly in my view. And secondly, that's a language that resonates with people. So if you say Israel is torturing people, it's killing people, it's destroying people's homes and so forth, people oppose that. And I don't think they find persuasive any attempt to say that complaining about that kind of thing is anti-Semitic. Those charges will be made, but I don't think they resonate. On the other hand, if one frames one's language in these abstract terms, like Zionism, we're opposed to Zionism, that can mean many things, and some of those, some possible meanings of that can be construed as, if not anti-Semitic, then at least discriminatory. It can mean, yeah, we think all Jews should be kicked out of Israel, and so. I think it's just making it easier than one needs to make it when one uses terms which are ambiguous and which therefore can be construed by opponents as meaning we're anti-Jewish, or we don't care about the rights of Jews in Israel, and so forth and so on.
But as you say, the opponents will always do that.
Yeah.
To me, I think it's more a question of the people watching, the people who are not ideologically involved.
Yeah.
How they are going to see that.
Exactly. And you know, I mean, this is just one example of Zionism. Like, firstly, some people, like on the right, for example, do use Zionism as a substitute for Jews. Secondly, as I say, it's an ambiguous term which can encompass anything from, let's say you oppose Zionism. It can mean anything from, I want a one person, one vote, equal rights situation for everyone in that region, to Israeli Jews should all be kicked out, and so on. So why, in my opinion, it's just a mistake to use terms which are so ambiguous that A, many people just tune out because they don't know what you mean when you say the term, and B, it makes the job easier for the other side to attribute to you what you don't actually mean, namely an anti-Semitic or discriminatory program. So that's just something I throw out there. The only other thing I would say, though, is even if the leadership of a movement agrees with what I've said and therefore does shape its messaging in the way that I've recommended, human rights language, clear, concrete, and so on, you can't police a whole movement. Like, there'll always be people who rightly will say things the way they want to say it. And so you can never accept and bow to the principle that a leadership of a party or movement has to police the way that all of its members, and should be held responsible for the way all of its members choose to articulate their own, their goals.
Now, you touched upon something we're also discussing a lot in the Red, Green Alliance. I was reading recently a book of, it's 20 years old, it's about the Danish Apartheid International Solidarity Movement about South Africa, and here there was a very interesting reading of how history analysis of what took place in South Africa was being used, and it turned out that the ANC was sort of for decades in the 50s, 60s, insisting in front of the International Solidarity Movement that South Africa could not only be reformed, it had to be totally disrupted. It had to be, you could not say that South Africa was a legitimate state. So it was really their push towards the International Solidarity Movement to win this, to actually frame it as a colonial creature and an anti-colonial fight. And that's probably why I'm the one who thinks that at least in our Red Green Alliance we are going to analyze what Zionism became and all this. We need to know in details and have our. I don't agree that the whole solidarity movement should be discussing Zionism always, but I think that the colonialism, the structures around that needs to be part of the movement to understand that, for instance, one of the things is that the Unity List wants to approve the two-state solution. We have it's not possible for the Red Green Alliance to say that we have constantly to say that Israel has a right to exist, and if you're not saying it, you are delegitimizing Israel, and here we are trapped in a way also. So when you use, we are not allowed to talk about apartheid. Apartheid has been censored out for many years. It was just recently that it came in again, and some of the Red Green Alliance writings talked about apartheid, but in general, in the public, sort of in the newspapers, apartheid is not allowed. So if
now the International Court of Justice was...
Yeah, I know, but Danish ordinary media, they never talks about human rights. I've been called out in this Red Green Alliance for being. Do you not agree that Hamas is a terrorist organization? I say no, because the UN does not call Hamas a terrorist organization. But then I'm already in minority, and I'm criticized within the Red Green Alliance because I don't want to call Hamas a terrorist organization. So we have the discourse in Denmark is moved away. We cannot even refer to human rights very much. That's a minority position. But it's a long discussion. But this about the Zionism, and the colonialistic sort of history, and to frame it in this way, I think is important. And it was nice to read the South African history a little bit about this, to make the sort of to see also maybe why South Africa is actually so active about Palestine now. There's the link, and I think the Irish understanding of Palestine is also part of that picture. Okay, long talk, sorry. I'm not the one to speak. So you have a question, and you certainly also have a comment. Others have some questions?
It's not so much a question, actually.
Okay, I think we're free. Oh yeah, you were actually first, and you didn't say something, so I'll let you speak first.
Okay, I just very short. Corbyn did get re-elected to Parliament, even though as a single independent among a few others. Does that have any importance, or is it just?
Look, it was a major. It was a huge thing that not just him, but several MPs from, several candidates who had never been. I mean, Corbyn had been a long-standing MP, but many others, it was their first, run, and they won as an independent around the issue of Gaza. And also others came close to unseating very prominent Labour figures. I mean, Andrew Feinstein, the Jewish South African former ANC MP, he ran in Starmer's constituency. Now, he didn't. There was still a gap, but he dramatically reduced Starmer's majority. And there were a couple of other high-profile scalps that were nearly taken. Jonathan Ashworth he would have been in the cabinet, and now he's not an MP, which was very satisfying. It has significance in the sense of it shows that the strength of feeling around this issue was enough to cause some real upset, and perhaps to show that if the left can organise strategically and perhaps focus its energies on a select number of particularly promising constituencies, it can upset the odds. I don't think it has importance in the sense of they're not enough. It's not a sizable enough block to actually be the key in deciding legislation and things like that. It's a small step, but. In the coming period, it's going to be extra parliamentary organising that will be the key, I think. I mean, the encouraging thing from the point of view of the prospects for left organising in Britain is Starmer's already so unpopular, and illusions about him really haven't lasted very long. They haven't survived contact with reality for very long. And so when that disillusionment deepens still further, there will be opportunities for oppositional forces on the right and the left. And we have to organise to take advantage of that. Yeah.
His vote count was also very low.
Yeah.
Så din tur, og så tager vi jer to bagefter.
Vi tror den først.
Ja.
Ja, så længe.
Før ham?
Ja, det tror du noget til. Ja, det ved jeg ikke. Jeg har tilbage sagt. Den har haft den op længe. Tak, hvor du siger.
This is tapping into Søs' perception on Hamas and all this terror thing, and being a minority in the organization. So this is tapping into this. I spoke to Erin Shine, that is volunteering in Amnesty, a Danish lawyer, and she says mutilation of babies was never sort of was not true. She says civilians are not civilians. They are, trained for being soldiers, women, men. Kibbutz are actually stolen land. Blah, blah. There's this venerable protocol that I read about, that the Israelis shoot their own soldiers in order to not let them become,
hostages.
Yeah, exactly. So what I see that is our problem is that we are accepting the right-wing media's attack on us. So we take upon us a defensive role and then again accepting that we actually did something wrong, instead of questioning the premises. Exactly, and saying, oh, stop, this narrative you're going on with and this framing of this whole problem, first of all, Israel has no right to defend themselves. I mean, they have no right to defend themselves. They stole land. So to me it's like, the problem is that we are accepting accusations instead of saying, stop, we don't want to discuss this, because there's nothing to discuss, sort of. If we could do that and stand strong, then I think we would not be in a minority, because we are,
Yeah, I guess my real quick statement on the issue of Zionism and whether talking or centering a critique of Zionism as an abstract concept is important. I do think that there is now I've been a student at Columbia University for the last year, and in Columbia University apartheid at best, and I do think that it is a positive thing that the term Zionist and this entire abstract concept of Jewish nationalism in the land of Israel or Palestine has now gotten among certain circles, among actually a lot of people, a negative perception because the discourse is centered on it. I think that's a good thing in general. However, I do agree with what you're saying, that when you keep the conversation limited to just abstractions of whether Jews have an abstract right to that land or whatever. That's why I think it's always important for all of us to really make these things as material as possible. When we're discussing something like Zionism, make it really material. What are the water distribution laws in the West Bank? What does the siege actually mean in Gaza in terms of the amount of building materials that come in and the calorie count that the Israeli army puts Gazan civilians on, or put them on for 17 years before the current genocide? What does it actually mean for the foundation of new villages or of infrastructure within 48 Palestine? So I don't know. I think that's it's possible to deal with these abstract categories in very material analysis. Without it necessarily just simply towing the line of Amnesty International, and whatever, which have done amazing work, and I think should be centered to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, on what you said, look, I think there's separate questions. There's two separate questions there. One is, well, what's the actual, to the best of our knowledge, view about what happened on October 7th and what Israel has a right to do under international law vis-a-vis Gaza and so forth. And the second question is, well, once we've reached our opinion on those questions, should we then still not voice that opinion because it would be attacked in the media as illegitimate or something? So those are the two separate questions. On the question of, well, I've already said my understanding of what happened on October 7th based on the Pillay investigation into it. It's true that there was a lot of fabricated atrocity stories, the 40 babies, and there were many fabricated stories about what happened that day. On the other hand, it's also true that hundreds of people were killed and hostages taken and so forth and so on. That's the best understanding to date that I'm aware of what happened that day. In terms of Israel's right to self-defense, it's true that you know, there's the technical point, or the technical legal point, and then there's the sort of intuitive moral sense of people. Technically, Israel, my understanding is, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is Israel cannot claim the right to self-defense as such vis-a-vis Gaza because it's territory Israel occupies. On the other hand, Israel can claim the right to use force to stop an ongoing armed attack against its civilian population. It just can't call that, it can't invoke as the legal instrument to justify that, this thing called the right to self-defense. And in terms of what will reach people, I don't think many people find persuasive that a state which is, even an occupying state, which is facing an ongoing, you know, invasion of one of its towns, cannot stop shooting, you know, cannot use force to stop its civilians getting shot. So I personally think it was a bit of a mistake for the South African team to focus so much on that particular kind of technical legal argument about which provision of international law could Israel properly invoke to justify taking action to stop the events of October 7th. But on the, that's on the substantive issue. On the kind of like strategic question of once you've reached your one's opinion on these questions, then as long as you think it's defensible, and it can be defensible in a way that can reach a broad public, which is what we're all trying to do, then I think just people should be honest and confidently say what they think, and not be scared of epithet that are directed at us. On the point about Zionism and the way that you can talk about the abstract category as well as the concrete, that's true. I just think, as opposed to in an intellectual seminar or in, I don't know, education programs within a party or something, where you might well want to go into the whole history of this ideological movement and what were the justifications it had and how did we think about those and so on. You can't avoid talking about Zionism if you're looking at the history of the conflict. But if we're talking about it as a political matter, what slogans do we use? I just don't. You can combine these abstract terms with the concrete, but you can also just avoid the abstract terms and talk about the concrete. I mentioned this the other day, so sorry if I'm repeating, but like I never hear Syrian activists in the UK who are trying to build public support for opposition to what the Assad regime is doing. They never talk about oh, we're anti-Ba'athist, and it's just most people don't know. They're not invested in this ideological dispute between Zionism and anti-Zionism. They don't know what it means. It can mean objectionable things as well as opposing it can mean objectionable things as well as defensible things. You just don't need to go there, I think. And it doesn't. By the way, it doesn't matter what you advocate for. If you advocate for a one-person, one-vote sort of system, just say one person, one, like we want one person, one vote and equal rights for everyone. Because currently, one group of people is in a position of supremacy over another, and it's undemocratic, and they're using that extra power to oppress them in all these ways. I just don't. Why go there and open up all these like theoretical debates? Are Jews a people? Does the Jewish people have a right to self-determination? In what form should that right to self-determination take? And there's no need for it, in my opinion.
Okay, you open up for another 2 hours discussion and another day and another again. I think we can have many different discussions. We are about to end now, but
ja.
Okay, sorry.
Du noterede det også.
Ja, og så glemte jeg det igen.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
When implementing, or if implementing this terrible law about anti-Semitism, our government wants to allocate 11 million kroner, mainly bestowed on the Jewish community, Jewish society, I say, to inform about Holocaust. And that might be noble and relevant, but there's not one penny to inform about Nakba. And I think that is there is an appalling lack of knowledge, both by the politicians and the press, and of course in the schools. I have 3 children, one from the mid-60s, one from the mid-70s, one from the mid-80s, and none of them have ever been taught about Nakba or the establishing of the Israeli state. It might be more, I wondered how it is in England, because it might be more infectious to talk about in England.
No
Since
we all take Nakba 101 in high school. No,
nowhere in Europe.
Yeah. I mean, in general, my feeling is that states, it's a good thing for them to fund in the education systems and, culturally, museums and so forth, education about especially that own state's crimes in the past and injustices committed by that society and that state. But you're right. There's very little public conversation about what happened in '48, and I would say, as importantly, the role of different other states, like Britain, say, in facilitating those injustices and enabling them. I mean, Britain, of course, played a very central role as in its capacity as the mandatory holder of Palestine back then. But in general, it's not just restricted to that. I mean, there's far too little confrontation with empire in general in Britain. I mean, I can't speak to the situation in Denmark, but it hasn't fully come to terms with, to say the least, its long role as an imperial power around the world, Palestine being one example. Yeah.
Okay, now I will end the meeting, but I think we have a nice recording of six lessons that can be turned around also to 6 counter strategies or 6 principal ways. I think if we are lucky, we can write them up and share them and talk about them, but we have them recorded first of all, which is nice, and thank you for giving the thought to...
So if you try them and it goes wrong, blame me.
Yeah. Yes, but at least we can start a discussion about them, I hope, in the Red Green Alliance, where we for sure are being turned around all this template, and the strategy is attacking the party a lot and the movement, and there's a lot of frustration around it. So I think it's valid for us to try to discuss these possible lessons and the counter strategies. So
I have a question for you, just a minute. I'm not a part of the Red Green Alliance anymore, and I don't think I'm going back. These things that you guys are going to use to discuss, will be available for other people?
I think so, yes, I think so. I have to discuss with Jørn where we do it and how we publish it, and Jonathan is usually putting something, so
okay.
we'll put it there, for sure. Good. Okay, thanks, Jane.
Thank you.